April 2nd, 1946. A prisoner gate opened on the Oklahoma prairie, and 23-year-old Marta Klein refused to walk through it. Her release papers were in one hand. A canvas bag was pressed against her ribs. Behind her, the wooden barracks stood quiet in the dust. In front of her was freedom, and she was terrified of it. The American guard at the gate did not understand. He had watched German prisoners celebrate release before. He had seen men laugh, shout, run, and fall to their knees. But the women in this compound did not run. They stood at the fence. They cried into their sleeves. Some begged the guards for one more week. Some asked to write one more letter. Some held the wire with both hands as if the fence was not a prison at all, but the last safe wall left in the world, because outside that gate was not home. Outside that gate was a ship across the Atlantic, then trains through a country broken into occupation zones, then streets without roofs, shelters without heat, families without names on any list. Inside the camp they had food, they had soap, they had books, they had a bed no bomb could reach. And the worst part was this. The country they had been taught to fear had treated them with more mercy than the country they had served. That was why a group of German women, captured in the final year of World War II, did something almost no prisoner was supposed to do. They fought to stay behind the wire, not because they loved captivity, but because freedom was sending them back to ruins. Most people know the image of German prisoners of war as men in field gray uniforms. Soldiers, tank crews, infantrymen, young men with hollow faces behind barbed wire. But the Reich also used women, not as frontline infantry, but as the invisible wiring of the war machine. They answered military phones. They operated switchboards. They worked in signals rooms. They tracked Allied aircraft on radar screens. They served in hospitals, offices, air defense posts, and command stations. Some were volunteers, some were pressured, some were ordered. By 1945, hundreds of thousands of German women had worn some form of military uniform or auxiliary clothing for a state that was collapsing around them. Marta Klein was one of them. She was born near Kassel, the daughter of a railway clerk and a church seamstress. Before the war reached her life directly, she imagined becoming a teacher. She kept notebooks filled with copied poems, vocabulary lists, and small drawings of buildings she wanted to see one day. Then, in late 1943, a notice arrived, not an invitation. An order. She was to report for service as a Luftwaffe signals helper. Her mother folded the notice twice and placed it on the kitchen table like it might burn her fingers. Marta remembered that morning for the rest of her life. The house smelled of boiled potatoes. The windows had blackout curtains. Her father was already gone, assigned to railway repair crews after bombings. Her mother did not say, "Be brave." She said, "Do what they tell you until you can come home." That was the entire plan for surviving Hitler's Germany. Do what they tell you. Keep your head down. Come home if the war allows it. For nearly 18 months, Marta worked in a communications post in Belgium. She passed messages she did not fully understand. She logged aircraft warnings. She learned to sleep through distant explosions and wake at the sound of a telephone bell. By January 1945, the German retreat had become a panic with uniforms. Files were burned. Trucks vanished in the night. Officers shouted orders nobody believed anymore. Then, near Liège, Marta's small unit was surrounded by American troops. The women were told the Americans would shoot them. They had heard it from posters, from speeches, from officers, from the radio. Americans were savage. Americans hated prisoners. Americans would do to German women what Germany had taught them enemies always did. So when a young American soldier approached Marta, she lowered her eyes and waited for the blow. Instead, he handed her a wool blanket. Then he pointed toward a field kitchen and said, in broken German, "Coffee." The cup was dented. The coffee was weak, but it was hot. And that was the first crack in the world she had been given. The Americans did not know what to do with the women at first. They were not ordinary civilians. They were not combat troops in the usual sense. They had served the military system, but many had never carried a weapon. For weeks, groups of captured German women were moved through holding areas in Belgium and France. The rooms were crowded. The food was thin. The rules changed with every officer. Then someone higher up made a practical decision: move them across the ocean. By early 1945, a small number of German female auxiliaries were placed on a transport ship bound for the United States and eventually sent inland to a women's enclosure attached to a POW compound on the open plains of Oklahoma. For most of them, America was not a country. It was a rumor, a monster from the radio, a place of factories, gangsters, chewing gum, and men who supposedly hated them. The Atlantic crossing took almost 3 weeks. The ship smelled of diesel, salt, vomit, and wet wool. Some women stayed below deck for days, too seasick to stand. Others prayed through the night, certain they were being taken somewhere worse than Europe. When the ship reached New York, Marta expected to see a city under blackout. Instead, she saw lights, real lights, windows glowing, harbor lamps burning, cars moving freely along the streets. There were no sirens, no ruins, no children carrying buckets through rubble. A woman beside her whispered, "They still have glass. Not food, not victory, not money, glass." Because by then, a window that was not shattered seemed like proof from another planet. From New York, the women were put on trains. For 3 days, they crossed America. Pennsylvania hills, Midwestern towns, flatlands that stretched so far the horizon looked unfinished. They stared through the train windows at farmhouses with painted porches, barns still standing, laundry drying in clean yards, and children riding bicycles as if the world had not ended. No one said much. The silence inside the rail car was not boredom. It was disbelief. By the time the train reached Oklahoma, the women were exhausted, frightened, and prepared for humiliation. They stepped down into a dry wind that smelled of dust and grass. The compound was simple: wooden barracks, a mess hall, a fence, guard towers, a water tank, a rectangle of scraped earth under an enormous sky. It was a prison, but it was not the nightmare they had been promised. The first morning, Marta woke before the whistle. For a moment, she could not understand what was wrong. Then she realized nothing was wrong. No artillery, no air raid siren, no officer screaming in the corridor, no engine diving overhead, only wind moving across the boards. Then came a smell from outside. Bacon. Real bacon. Marta sat up so fast the bunk shook. In Germany, meat had become a rumor. Butter had become memory. Coffee was usually roasted grain, pretending to be coffee. In the mess hall that morning, the women moved like sleepwalkers. They received eggs, toast, bacon, oatmeal with sugar, coffee strong enough to leave a taste, a small cup of orange juice. One woman began to laugh. Then she covered her mouth because the laugh turned into a sob. Marta did not eat at first. She stared at the tray. In Germany, she had been free and hungry. Here, she was a prisoner and being fed like someone's daughter. That contradiction did more than fill her stomach. It damaged the story she had been taught to believe. The camp had rules. There were roll calls. There were work assignments. There were guards. But the rules were not built to break them. The women cleaned barracks, washed laundry, worked in the kitchen, tended a small vegetable plot, and sewed repairs for camp supplies. They earned small canteen credit for their labor. They could buy soap, stationery, toothpaste, cigarettes, and chocolate when it was available. The camp infirmary treated fevers, infections, toothaches, and exhaustion. For women who had just come out of the last winter of Nazi Germany, basic care felt almost indecent. Some distrusted it. Some assumed kindness was a trap. Some believed the Americans were softening them for interrogation. But the cruelty never arrived. Then came the schoolroom. An empty barracks was converted into a classroom. A German-speaking instructor, a refugee woman who had left Europe before the war, began teaching English, arithmetic, and American civics. The women sat on benches with pencils in their hands like schoolgirls. At first, they were suspicious of every lesson. Democracy sounded like enemy propaganda. Free speech sounded like a phrase no serious government would allow. Newspapers disagreeing with each other looked like disorder. But the instructor did not shout. She did not force confessions. She answered questions. And for many of the women, that was more dangerous than any lecture, because answers made them compare. Compare what they had been told with what they were seeing. Marta attended every class. She copied English words in a notebook. Shelter, mercy, permission, future. Some words were easy to translate. Others changed shape once she lived inside them. The camp also had a small library. German novels, English readers, old magazines, a few history books, maps of the United States. On warm afternoons, Marta would sit under the thin shade of a barracks wall and read slowly, one finger under the line. She learned the names of states she had only seen on propaganda maps: Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, Oregon, Minnesota. The names sounded impossible, too large for a girl who had once believed her whole future would fit between castle and a classroom. The other women changed too. They stopped flinching when guards walked by. They began to speak openly at meals. They laughed during volleyball games in the yard, awkwardly at first, then with real sound. On Sundays, local clergy came to hold services. Catholic in the morning, Protestant in the afternoon. Nobody demanded they prove loyalty. Nobody asked them to denounce their families before they could pray. That mattered more than anyone said. By summer, the fence no longer felt like one thing. To the Americans, it was still a boundary. To the women, it became something stranger, a line between the camp and the war. Inside, there was routine. Outside, somewhere across the ocean, Germany was collapsing into hunger, revenge, and rubble. For a few impossible months, They were suspended between the world that had used them and the world that had not yet decided what they were. Then the letters arrived. Mail came in bundles, often late, often damaged, sometimes with words cut out by censors. Every arrival turned the women quiet. A name called from the office window meant someone might still be alive. Marta received her first letter in September. It was from her aunt, written in a cramped hand on paper so thin the ink bled through. Her father was dead. A raid in March had struck the rail yards and the worker shelter beside them. No proper grave, no final words. Just a list posted after the fires cooled. Her mother had survived, but the family apartment was gone. The church where she sewed vestments had burned. Neighbors were living in cellars. Food was being traded for coats, shoes, wedding rings, anything that could be carried. Marta read the letter once, then again, then a third time, as if the words might change out of pity. They did not. She walked behind the laundry shed and sat in the red dirt. She did not cry. That frightened her most. Her grief did not arrive as tears. It arrived as emptiness, a clean, cold place in the middle of her chest. She was not alone. All through the compound, letters cut open the women one by one. A sister killed in Dresden, a husband missing near the Oder, a mother sleeping in a school basement, a child evacuated and never found, a town burned so completely that no street names meant anything anymore. The women had spent months saying, "When we go home." After the letters, they said, "If there is a home." Then, eventually, they stopped using the word home at all. A guard named Daniel Mercer noticed the change. He was 22, from Missouri, and had lost a cousin in France. When the women first arrived, he had kept his face hard. He did not want to pity them. Pity felt like betrayal. But after mail days, he saw women who had once served the enemy sit on barrack steps with letters shaking in their hands. He heard one woman ask, in English, "Where do I go if my street is gone?" No one had an answer. Mercer later told another guard, "I thought release meant giving them back their lives. I did not understand that some of their lives were already burned down." By November, the camp had become emotionally impossible. The women were safer as prisoners than their families were as civilians. They had more food behind the wire than their mothers had outside it. They had English lessons while siblings searched for coal. They had medical care while old neighbors died of fever in cellars. Guilt entered the camp like weather. It settled on meals, on blankets, on books, on laughter. Marta wrote in her notebook one night, "I want to go to my mother. I am ashamed that I want to stay. I am ashamed that I am not ashamed enough." That sentence followed her for years. Because the truth was not simple. She loved her mother. She wanted to find her. She feared what Germany had become. She feared what she had been part of. And she feared that America, the enemy, had shown her a version of life she could no longer forget. Then the announcement came. In December, the women were called into the mess hall. A military officer stood at the front with a typed sheet in his hand. His voice was formal, almost gentle. All remaining German prisoners would be repatriated in the coming months. Transport schedules were being arranged. The women would be returned to Europe in groups. No one shouted. No one protested at first. The room simply went still. Marta looked down at her plate and understood the awful joke. The war was over. the gates would open, and freedom had become the thing they feared. That night, 7 women gathered near the wash house. They spoke in low voices, out of habit more than necessity. A former radio operator named Annalisa Brandt said what the others were thinking. "We can ask to stay." Another woman shook her head. "Prisoners must be sent back. It is the rule." "Rules are made by people," Annalise said. "Then people can read letters." That was how the campaign began, not with escape, not with violence, not with a riot, with stationery. The women wrote to churches, to aid organizations, to local officials, to anyone whose name appeared in a newspaper. Their English was uneven, but the meaning was sharp. "We have no homes. We will work. We are not asking for comfort. We are asking not to be returned to hunger. We are asking for a chance to live." Marta wrote 5 letters in 1 week. Her first draft was too formal. Her second was too desperate. Her third she tore into strips. The fourth said only what mattered. "I was told America was cruel. That was not true. I was told Germany would be waiting for me. That is not true either." She signed her name slowly. Marta Elizabeth Klein, as if writing it clearly might make her more real to the stranger who read it. To their shock, some people answered. A minister from a small Oklahoma church visited the camp in January. He did not arrive with cameras. He brought a notebook and listened. The women showed him photographs. A street in ruins, a burned church, a family portrait with names crossed out in pencil. He left visibly shaken. Within weeks, church members offered to house several women and vouch for them if the government allowed them to remain. A local newspaper printed a careful article about the women who feared being sent back to Europe. A few readers were sympathetic. Others were furious. The country had lost sons to Germany. Why should German prisoners be given mercy? That anger was real, and the women knew it. Marta never pretended she had a claim stronger than an American mother who buried a son. That was part of the cruelty of the situation. No one's pain erased anyone else's. But the machinery of law moved without room for that complexity. The answer came back the same every time. No. Prisoners of war were to be repatriated. Sympathy did not change status. Church support did not erase classification. Newspaper attention did not override policy. The women had written themselves into the public eye, and still the gate remained pointed toward Germany. In February, Marta received the rejection notice. She folded it once, then twice, then placed it between the pages of her English notebook. That night she packed, then unpacked, then packed again. The bag looked childish on the bunk. 2 dresses, a sweater, letters, a pencil. A small English reader the teacher had quietly allowed her to keep. Her whole new life fit into cloth. The first truck convoy came in March. Women stood in line with bags at their feet. The guards checked names from a clipboard. Some women kissed the hands of the teachers. Some gave away canteen items they could not carry. Some pressed notes into the palms of friends who were leaving later. The compound looked different that morning. The same fence, the same towers, the same mess hall. But now every ordinary thing had become unbearable because it was about to disappear. Annalise climbed into the first truck. Before the canvas flap dropped, she leaned out and called to Marta. "Do not let this be the end." Marta tried to answer. No sound came. She lifted one hand. The truck moved, raising a trail of dust. For a long time after it vanished, the dust stayed hanging in the road like smoke. Marta's group left 2 weeks later. On her final evening, she walked to the fence alone. The prairie was turning gold. Wind moved through dry grass. A dog barked somewhere beyond the compound. The world was so quiet that she could hear the wire move against its posts. A camp officer found her there. He was not cruel. He was not warm either. He was a tired man doing a job history had made ugly. "I am sorry," he said. Marta kept looking at the horizon. "You gave us more than you were required to give." He had no answer for that. After a while, he said, "I hope Germany rebuilds." Marta turned then. "What happens to people who cannot wait that long?" The officer looked away first. The next morning, her name was called. Klein, Marta Elizabeth. She walked to the truck with her bag in one hand and the English notebook in the other. At the gate, she stopped. The guard who had once seen her arrive now held the release list. For a second, neither moved. Then he stepped aside. The gate was open. Marta crossed it like a woman walking into a sentence. The journey back took nearly a month. Train east. Ship across the Atlantic. Crowded decks. Gray water. Women wrapped in blankets, watching the horizon as if they could delay land by staring hard enough. When the ship reached Bremerhaven, the port looked wounded. Cranes bent over the water. Warehouses stood blackened. Windows were missing from entire blocks. The air smelled of coal smoke, sewage, salt, and damp brick. Marta stepped onto German soil and felt nothing. Not joy, not homecoming, not relief. Only a heaviness so complete it seemed to enter through her shoes. She found her mother 6 weeks later in a displaced person's shelter outside Kassel. The shelter was an old school building with broken windows patched in cardboard. Families slept in classrooms. Children coughed at night. Soup was ladled from a metal vat so thin you could see the bottom before the line ended. Her mother was smaller. That was Marta's first thought. Not older, not sick, smaller, as if the war had folded her inward. When Marta said, "Mama," the woman stared as if hearing a language from childhood. Then she reached for her daughter and made a sound that was not quite crying. They stood in the hallway surrounded by strangers, holding each other beside a wall where a map of Europe still hung with countries that no longer felt real. Marta stayed. She cleared rubble. She washed laundry for occupation staff. She translated simple notices for people who could not understand English signs. She traded cigarettes she received as payment for potatoes, coal, and medicine. Every day was practical. Every day was humiliating. Every day required a small surrender. She had escaped the camp and returned to a country where survival itself felt like imprisonment. But she did not speak of Oklahoma often. When she did, people misunderstood. Some thought she was bragging. Some thought captivity had confused her. Some accused her of becoming too fond of the enemy. So she learned to keep the memory private, the bacon smell, the schoolroom, the clean beds, the huge sky, the fence that had held back the war. She carried them silently. In 1948, her mother died of pneumonia. There was no money for a proper headstone. Marta carved her mother's name into a small wooden marker and stood beside it in freezing rain until her hands went numb. After the burial, something inside her went quiet. Not the hollow shock of the first letter, something steadier, a decision, There was nothing left in Germany that could become a future for her. So she began the long work of returning to the country she had once entered as a prisoner. It took years, forms, interviews, rejected applications, new forms, references, work records, proof that she was employable, proof that she had no criminal charge, proof that she could become useful to a nation that had once guarded her. Marta took translation jobs with American occupation offices. She learned English until she stopped translating every sentence in her head. She saved coins in a tin under her bed. She wrote to the Oklahoma minister who had once tried to help. He wrote back, not quickly, not with promises, but with a statement that he remembered her. Sometimes that is enough to keep a person moving. In 1953, Marta Klein received permission to immigrate to the United States. When her ship entered New York Harbor, she stood at the rail before dawn. The Statue of Liberty appeared slowly through the morning haze. Marta had seen it once before, through the eyes of a prisoner being transported inland. This time she saw it as a woman carrying one suitcase and a stack of approved papers. She cried then, not loudly, not theatrically, just with both hands on the rail, letting the tears fall into the cold harbor wind. She did not stay in New York. She went back to Oklahoma, not because it was easy, not because it was glamorous, but because the first version of safety she had ever chosen for herself had been there. She found work in Tulsa as a secretary for an equipment company. She rented a small room, then an apartment. She joined a church. She bought a second-hand radio. She planted geraniums in coffee cans on the windowsill. Piece by piece, she built a life that did not ask her to be heroic, only steady. Years later, she located several of the women from the camp. Annalisa was in St. Louis. Another had married a machinist in Ohio. One became a nurse in Illinois. One returned to Germany and never wrote again. Their letters were not dramatic. Recipes, children, jobs, church picnics, illness, weather. But underneath every ordinary sentence was the same impossible fact. They had survived the return. Some had found their way back. Some had built American lives out of the wreckage of German ones. Marta never called the camp a prison when speaking to her grandchildren. She called it the place in Oklahoma. That was all. After she died, her family found the English notebook in a box at the back of a closet. Inside were vocabulary lists from 1945. Shelter, mercy, permission, future. Between the pages was the folded rejection notice from February 1946, and behind it a small photograph. A fence across a flat field, a water tower in the distance, nothing else. On the back, in careful handwriting, Marta had written 5 words. The first place I breathed. That was the part history struggled to hold. These women were not simple heroes. They were not simple villains. They had served a regime built on lies. Then they were held by the enemy and discovered that mercy could come from the wrong side of the map. Their story does not fit cleanly into victory speeches. It is too uncomfortable for that, because it asks what freedom means when home has been destroyed. It asks what happens when a prison becomes a shelter. It asks how a person rebuilds a conscience after learning that almost everything she was told was false. For Marta and the women like her, America did not begin as a dream. It began as a fence, a mess hall, a schoolroom, a guard who did not strike them, a cup of coffee handed across the wreckage of a war. And sometimes the place that saves you first does not look like home. It looks like the last gate you are afraid to leave.